What do you feel when you look at your clothing?
Um, so sometimes I'm like with the red faux fur, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like assaulting my eyes right now. It's kind of like menacing, and I'm like, but this is really cool. And when I love just big text. It like really, it's just like satisfies my eyes so much. But when I'm in the mood to talk and to engage and I have a really open energy, they're great pieces to wear because people are like, oh, and it's like all social experimentation, right? And that's like I love messing with the population. It's great. And people on their like day to day walks or, whatever. And it's just like, bam.
You kind of startle them a bit.
Yeah, it's great.
And it's more than messing because it really provokes some thought. It's like, oh, wait a minute. What does this message mean?
Yes.
What is this?
Yes. And it's not a message that is easily digestible, but also at the same time is contemplative, or at least I like to think, it has layers to it. And really, I want people to have this dose of skepticism about the reality that surrounds them and their own relationship to authenticity and truth and what that means for them. But I had someone tell me one time, he was like, you are meant to disturb people in the most charming of ways. And I
Yeah,
was
like
like,
I'm thinking
I love that.
disruption.
Disruption's great.
In business, it can be the most amazing thing.
That's cool.
And you also, I've noticed, like sort of steer clear of anything that's, you said it has multiple layers.
Mm-hmm.
Very interpretable, nothing too like obviously controversial almost. Is that the right way to put it?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I probably one of the most straightforward things I've said is you have been lied to. And people are like, oh, well, about what? And I was like, I mean, that could be an endless thing. You could be lied to by our parents, by our professors, by the media, by the government, it could just go on and on. Or it could be personal, like a lover or, something more one-to-one. But even that phrase is broad, right? But that's like the tricky part about working with language is at least I want, a personal and universal dialogue where people can interpret it on a micro level, and then also it could be on a macro level.
Well, so let's go back to sort of the beginning because
Sure.
I could talk about the pieces forever, but our viewers and our listeners don't necessarily know. Where did this process begin for you?
So I studied photography at the School of Visual Arts in New York. I was in New York for 8 years, and very grateful for my time there and for studying at SVA. And I was in the photo lab, and I'm working on this photograph, and I was photographing a lot of portraits, a lot of fashion editorial, a lot of so fashion was always something that I really loved, but I was kind of photographing fashion in a way that I was critiquing fashion. I was kind of critiquing the industry, and I had an image, and I wanted to put pray and pray, the Pray and Prey on the image, and I was like, this isn't working. It was like very contrived. It felt really forced, and then it was probably about 2 to 3 weeks prior to that, my dad gifted me this fur coat, a mink coat that he got at an auction for $10. And he was like, oh my God, I really wanted to give this to you. And it was a really like sweet gesture. And I was like, accepted it, just kind of being like, where am I going to wear this? Like, what am I going to do with this? I was like, thanks so much, Dad. And my mom was like, you need to put that in a thrift shop. Like PETA's going to come after you and put paint on you. And then I was like, you know what? Pour paint on me. Like that would be a performance. It'd be great. But also at the same time, I'm like, what am I going to do with this coat? So I like honestly like balled up this mink coat. I put it in a bag and it was in my apartment. And then, I'm in the photo lab and I'm working on this photograph. And I was like, holy shit. These words need to go on this mink, on the back of the mink. And I like got up, I took all my things and like ran home and then went into the other SVA building and and then aim to print on it. And a lot of the lab techs were like, oh, this isn't going to work. It's not going to work. And I was like, I have a feeling, like, let's just try it. And also it was like $10. You like, what's the big deal? And then I printed it and everyone in the lab was like, oh my God. And then I sort of became like the girl who prints on fur, which was quite funny because then it became, and I did pray, repeating down all the way down the back. And then this project around predation and also this commentary on class, the woman in fur, and I started doing performances in the fur coats. I started doing installations in galleries with the fur coats.
What do you mean?
So I had like the fur coats kind of crawling up a wall. I worked in this space. I still work with them called Pen and Brush in New York City. They're on East 22nd Street. Fantastic space. They've let me like do all kinds of crazy shenanigans. 2 floors. I did a performance where I displayed the fur coat as an object, and then I had photographs that I took of me in the studio where I'm kind of hiding under the coats and just like my back is exposed. So there was the photographs and then the object, from the photographs underneath. So I came in, I walked in, and they knew I was going to do this. I asked them like 4 days prior to the event because I had the idea 4 days prior to the opening. And I was like, hey, I want to come in and put on the fur coat and then start walking around. And I wrote these cryptic notes to mostly men about, I've been following you all day. I know where you live.
On like little pieces of paper?
Yes. So I was acting as a predator. And then I did other things where I had like a disposable camera and I was photographing people without their permission because, the camera and photography is also like the language behind it is inherently violent, like let me capture you, let me take your picture, let me shoot you. And I've always had this thought of like, it's unsettling if you're like, someone's taking a picture of me and like, why? And, surveillance, like it's all these things, right? So I was like, okay, that's a notion of predation that I'll use. And it's also, photography is what I've studied, so it kind of ties in there. And then I was prey for like a half an hour as well, where I kind of like tugged on people's shirts and wrote things like, no one in here will do anything. Can you get me out of here? I laid on the ground and started writing kind of, I was like dead. And then I started writing these notes of like names of victims and predators from all over the globe.
And there are times, I'm guessing, where you do the thing and it doesn't come out the way that you thought.
Oh my gosh, totally. Yeah, that's happened. And I'm like, I did this project called, Will You Buy Me? And I was adhering this QR code on the back, on my back, fake tattoo, but a real code. And I was going to do the performance at an art fair in New York, and I asked someone to put on the code, and the corner was like smudged, and it didn't work. And I was like, I didn't just fly here to do a thing or anything. And I was like, fuck. And I'm like, you know what? Well, I should have had a plan B, and I didn't. And then I ended up putting the code on my front. It wasn't the same, but it was a really good experience for me because sometimes you do those things and you just make a mistake. And I'm like, that's okay, Katelyn.
Yeah.
Like, it's fine. So words for me are obviously like the thing, but where the process is not linear. And also it's like that voice of like, oh, something's gonna mess up can be like a really, whatever that like quote unquote mess up is, can be like really what makes the thing. Right. Have it be a talk or a work or, my clothing, it's like messy, right? Like it's not very clean. There's always kind of like something dripping or like messed up. And I'm like, that's great. I couldn't even conceptualize that if I wanted to. It's just in the process of printing that happens. So I did this project with the text on my skin, and then I started printing on just like everyday wear. And I had this phrase, never trust the nice ones, which is with us here. And I printed this phrase on like a small faux fur vest, and I would bartend in it. And it was kind of like an accessory piece. I was wearing it. And this guy comes in, and I worked at this bar called The Coffee Shop in New York City. It was like a very iconic diner, like upscale diner, had this S bar, very cool place, closed down in 2018, unfortunately. But it I'm wearing this. So all kinds of people would come into this place, right? And I'm wearing it, and this guy goes, "How much for your vest?" He's like, "I have a friend. She's a musician. She would totally love it." And I was just like, $300. Like it just the number that came out of my mouth. And he was like, "Okay, here is money for my bar tab. Here's your tip for your bar tab, and here's $300." And I took it off my back and I put it in a paper bag and I gave it to him, like across the bar. And like all my colleagues were like, "Did you just sell that off of your back?" And I was like, "Yes." It was great. I made like $700 that day. It was awesome.
And had you ever had anyone ask you to buy that right off
No.
yourself?
No. But honestly, thinking back, I'm like, that's something I should just do all the time now. Where people are like, "I love it." I'd be like, "It's for sale. Buy it here."
Totally.
And I'm not really ready for it when I do it now. But I was like, I was ready then, and I had no idea what I was even doing. And so it's it's a good story.
And wearing it, and I know because I now own some, so it's very interactive.
Mm-hmm.
Wearing it, you get all kinds of approaches, people asking all kinds of things. And what are some of the things that people tend to say to you?
Well, never trust the nice ones is interesting because some people are like, "Well, that's shitty advice." And I'm like, "Well, it's about people that use kindness for nefarious purposes, blah, 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 blah." And they're like, "Oh, okay." And then other people are like, "Yes." And they totally understand. They understand it like one-to-one very quickly. And that tells me that many people have come across at least one or two damaging manipulators in their life. And I was like, that's interesting. So this is like these personalities and these people are out there all the time. And I just kind of like to shed a little light on them because I don't think it's something that gets spoken about nearly enough. And it's all over the place. So that's always interesting. I have None of This Is Real, which people sort of like have this chuckle at, because that's like, reality and also like the faux fur itself. I haven't had anyone say anything like overtly rude or condescending. But, I have this one on my back that says, "A mass majority of your reality is well-crafted performative art." And I was wearing it in New York City, and this guy's riding his bike, and he stopped his bike. He was like, "Oh my God, I love your blazer. I love what it's saying," And I was like, "Yeah, man." He's like, "It's all a performance." I was like, "Yeah, man." And so people can get like really revved up, which is fun. So yeah, I like that.
It's also really cool how a certain kind of message attracts a certain kind of person that you would have otherwise not been able to connect with.
Yes. So cool.
It's like a beacon.
Totally. And that's like really the whole point of a line of Cope and the clothing is for people to engage in dialogue, to people to meet people that they wouldn't normally meet, and to kind of like open up the discussion of whatever the message is, but then, then it can kind of carry on and go on into the rest of someone's day and stay with them. And it's like, oh, that's really cool. I met this person, and people are having thoughts that they didn't have or prior, or then you met someone new, which is always great. But I like people to, talk and to engage in some sort of conversation.
And as you're building these people who really are drawn to you for the right reasons, in some cases they literally want to buy the thing off of your back, and you're beginning to build a customer base effectively and a brand, I'm curious from a business model standpoint, because when the guy bought it off your back at the bar, it wasn't really a business at that point, would you say? So how do you then, what's the creative evolution to think to yourself, like, I want to make money at this?
Yeah, that's like... has been such a journey and like is still even a work in progress to this day. But I've come to the conclusion of, because I was doing things where I was selecting these garments and then making a phrase for the specific garment, and then like that garment would have its own statement, and then I would do another one, and and then I would photograph these garments, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so much work. And then I was doing pants and I was doing bags, and I was like, all right, Katelyn, like maybe if you want to do a phrase, do it multiple times, like do a limited edition of 10 or something, and then then it's like one statement, and then I can photograph it in a way that's it's more simple. And that's a tendency I tend to do, of like, I just want to say it all. I want to show it all. And it's like, you could just show a couple pieces and it can be really minimal.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, the first epiphany was one phrase could have 10 limited edition widgets to sell. And then the next evolution was one phrase could be printed across any garment, including a customer who has a garment, you could print it on that.
Yes.
So is that the current and final, the most recent evolution?
Yes.
Of the business model? And how are you feeling about that in terms of work and output?
It's exciting. I mean, I also, with like the commissions, I really worked through that mental gymnastics as well, because I was like, what? I'm like, yeah, I could do a commission for you. And I was just like really excited and happy whenever anyone wanted to do something. And then I'm like, wait a minute, am I creating new phrases for people, or am I already pulling a phrase that I have already existing and placing that on their garment? And if I'm doing the former, if I'm creating something new for someone, that requires so much more brain activity and brain energy. And I'm like, well, that's going to be a higher price point because I haven't even thought of that phrase yet. And this is where I would do like a consultation with someone. And I'm like, what are you thinking about? What are you passionate about? Like, send me some things, some quotes, some books you like to read, and I use it all as inspiration. And then I kind of create like a series of like 3 to 5 phrases off of their initial inspirations, and then I send it back to them. But that process takes a lot of time, and that was something that I realized. I'm like, oh, like you can't just like give it all away, right? So I'm like, let me take a step back, because I could do things that are more simple, because I have this like trove of treasure trove of like phrases that already exist, and then but if I make something new, that's kind of its own thing as well.
Join our creative business community at HereGoesNothin.com.